Sound check, testing 1 2. Sound check, testing 1 2.
Check 1 2 1 2. So I'm gonna write it out.
Yes, yes. Okay.
I hope that wasn't me. Yeah.
So at any time, here's a countdown. We have 1 hour. We'll take a break halfway through. So if anytime you want to know what time, maybe we start at 1 here. So at 1:01, we'll do a 1 minute intro, and then take over. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, 5 seconds.
St. Kitts, Nevis, at the nicest place. When I run from here, man, you feel it like a lunch, I say. Now sell out me country, my little paradise, yeah. I am a product of the island. I know it's a nice. Wouldn't change if you know what I know. Land of beauty.
The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents conversations, reflections, and a way forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we discuss the Sustainable Island State Agenda. The St. Kitts.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Kuna Caribbean Conference Center in Fort Lands, Bastille. I'm Ian Richards, welcoming you to Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. Conversations is a 7-part engagement series commissioned by the Independence 40 Committee. Tonight, as you would have heard in the intro, we discuss the Sustainable Island State Agenda. It has been presented as a priority by the government of St. Kitts and Nevis as it pursues changes to the way we work, live, and play in St. Kitts and Nevis. Our conversation begins now with Timothy Antoine, Governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, and Dr. Janice Daniel Hodge, elected member of the Nevis Island Assembly. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So we want to start our conversation tonight, and before we dig into the sustainable agenda of it, we want to look at the small island state, which of course is what St. Kitts and Nevis is, a small island developing states, often referred to as SIDS. How do you define a small island developing state?
So basically, small island. So let me start by saying greetings to all our viewers and listeners in St. Kitts and Nevis and around the world. A small island developing states, so-called SIDS, is a special category for small countries, island states, that was established by the United Nations in 1992. So that's about 31 years ago. And it was recognized then that many of these states, including St. Kitts and Nevis, had very special, unique characteristics. For example, they were small, many of them less than 1 million people. They had limited or no natural endowments or resources, no oil, no gas, no minerals. They were extremely vulnerable to external shocks, whether they be economic or climatic. And they were, in many instances, very dependent on one sector, in this case, in our case, tourism. I should say, something that is often missed is that while these are small states, small island development states, and there are about almost 60 of them, so 39 independent states, including St. Kitts and Nevis, and then there are the associate states like Montserrat and so on, so that's another 18 or so. One of the things that's missed about these SIDS, for all our challenges, is that we are large ocean states. So, for example, in St. Kitts and Nevis, the area here is, I think, about 68 square miles. But if you look at the ocean size of St. Kitts and Nevis, it's at least 25 times that. So we're talking about perhaps 2,000 square miles. And that is important because it is a window into an opportunity that we have hitherto not considered seriously enough. And that is, of course, the blue economy. So SIDS is a category in development, category of states, set up by the United Nations in 1992 to address the unique and challenges of small island developing states, and not just to identify them, but also to secure for them special and differential treatment. That is to say, development assistance that would allow them to overcome these challenges and to secure their development. And that's a very important category in our global economy. So that's the nutshell for SIDS. Of course, what has come since is the articulation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. But SIDS, Small Island Developing States, is a special category of which St. Kitts and Nevis is a part to address our unique development challenges.
Dr. Daniel Hodge?
Sure, and if I can add, in the Caribbean, the small island developing states, we would recognize that because of the geography, we are vulnerable to natural disasters, hurricanes, etc. But one of the things about Caribbean states which makes us even more vulnerable is the fact that most of our towns are coastal. And this is something that originated back in the colonial days to facilitate shipping. And as you would be aware, when we have natural disasters, when we have hurricanes, when we have storm surges, for example, not only is the industry at risk, not only are the residences at risk, but with the towns for most of the Caribbean islands situated along the coast, then we are really concerned about what would happen to our infrastructure, such as our major ports, our financial institutions. Of course, many of our hotels that support the tourism sector are also located on the coast. So here in the Caribbean, when we look at SIDS and the vulnerability that we have to the natural disasters, the impacts of climate change, etc., from our very history, we recognize that we are unique in a way that because we are small, as the governor mentioned, because we are small, we are very dependent on our coastal areas. And so the vulnerabilities that we speak of when we speak of SIDS is even more so magnified in the Caribbean countries because of the way that we developed over the years and continue to develop, because as it is today, the development to support tourism is, as much as we try to mitigate, we understand that the impacts of climate change, for example, are very ravaging. We would recognize when Hurricane Omar would have passed through the region, it was not even a hurricane when it passed through the region, but it actually damaged the Four Seasons Hotel in Nevis, and that hotel had to be closed for over 2 years. And so just imagine as the second largest employer in the island, on the island, and all of those persons being out of work, we could understand how vulnerable our economies are, our living, our livelihoods are. And so certainly, as the governor mentioned, the category that would allow for special assistance for us to build resilience against some of the global issues that we're dealing with now is definitely needed, and it's something that we are happy that at least that categorization was made so that the small island states can be looked at in a way that looks at the peculiarities that we have and why it may be so difficult for us to develop as economically as we would want.
I want to look at the United Nations definition of a small island developing state, which captures exactly what you would have said, but there are some things that I want to pull out there. And it says that a small island developing states include low-lying coastal countries that share similar sustainable development challenges, including a small population, limited resources, remoteness, susceptibility to natural disasters, vulnerability to external shocks, and excessive dependence on international trade. Now, Dr. Hodge, you spoke about the Hurricane Omar, that was tropical storm at the time when it passed through, and the damage that it caused. So that really, you would say, highlight the threats that are available or that threaten our St. Kitts and Nevis Federation, and of course, other SIDS, of course, in terms of climate change. We see what's happening in Europe, Canada, and it's affecting the United States in terms of the wildfires. Of course, we would have seen the intense storms of Hurricane Irma and the damage that she did, and Hurricane Maria as well as they passed through the region. So can you comment on the dangers that we face in terms of climate change as it relates to us being as SIDS?
Certainly. So because we said we are small islands and our livelihoods primarily depend on the coastal area, and the economy of the country is heavily dependent on coastal development. As you would recognize, we do have a huge tourism sector from the cruise ship industry, and we would have seen not only from the natural disasters, but even from COVID-19, when the ports were closed, that there really was a challenge to deal with some of the basic needs. Because we're small and we actually do import a lot more than we export, then when we have damage from hurricanes, etc., or even from the impacts of climate change with storm surge, etc., then it is more difficult for us to be able to receive goods. And of course, we're not a country, St. Kitts and Nevis, we're not a country that is involved much with developing the manufacturing sector, etc. And so we look at the vulnerabilities to the livelihoods of our people, not only those who work in the tourism industry, but also we look at our fishers. One of the things that we are seeing happening now, and it's related to climate change and the increase in temperatures, is the influx of sargassum. And we recognize that our fishing industry is seriously impacted. There are some fish landing sites where the sargassum is so thick that it is very difficult for the boaters to move. Now, not only are the fishers and their livelihoods impacted, but the same sargassum also impacts the tourism industry negatively. Because, of course, we understand with the sargassum, once it accumulates on the shore and it starts to break down, then it gives off this pungent scent that is dangerous to human health as well as to the economy, the business that we're having.
And it's also difficult to get rid of, from what I understand.
It is difficult to get rid of, and that is something that is going to lead into some of the sustainable industries that we may want to look at a bit later. But because our towns are low-lying, they're on the coast, when we have storm surge, when we have hurricanes, etc., the damage to ports is significant. But also, because the towns are in the coastal area, we also see a lot of our infrastructure, our telecommunication systems would be impacted. But also, right here in St. Kitts Nevis, we recognize the impact to roads. And we know down at Olwo what would have happened when you had, the rough seas, the roads are damaged. And what would be required to relocate these roads is a serious concern, it's a serious challenge, because we know even though some of these roads are along the coast and they're being impacted, it's really a matter of where we continue to try to, ensure that they're sturdy enough. And so once you come to continuously try to fix and maintain these coastal roads, of course, that's eating away at the budget that you can have for other programs, so to speak. And so because so much of our infrastructure is on the coast, because so much of our livelihoods are dependent on the coast, you would appreciate that the impacts of climate change is really creating a bit of a challenge. I would just add one other factor. Because we're so dependent on tourism and there is so much need to develop along the coast, because, of course, the sand and the sea is our natural resource. That is what the tourists come for. And so it's very rare that you'll find a new hotel development going up in the mountains. However, when we look at those low-lying coastal areas, in some of those areas, we really do have natural buffers to help protect us against the impacts of climate change and storm surge, etc. And so you would find that in the small islands, the economies are small, we're dependent on tourism. There was a lot of development along the coast, but then in doing so, we are also impacting the natural buffers that we may have to help us build some resiliency.
And Governor Dr. Daniel Hodge spoke about the damages and the possibility of relocating roads because of the damage that will be caused by the storm surge. But there's also the possibility of the rising sea level, which means that you may have to relocate villages, move the population out.
Indeed, it's a tremendous challenge. We are coastal states, and as Dr. Hodge said, I mean, the truth is 90% of our built environment is along the coast, including our tourism, as Dr. Hodge indicated, which of course is our major driver of economic activity. And therefore, there are real challenges. And that is why in the international community, we call for St. Kitts and Nevis, small states in the Eastern Caribbean and elsewhere, for not just resources for our development, not just resources for mitigation, which is the lowering of greenhouse emissions, but adaptation, which is to say, being able to generate resources to lift our seawalls, to move our roads inland, to relocate villages where that is required. That is very expensive. And at the moment, when you look at the international development landscape, much of the resources, which are woefully short of what is required, I might add, most of those resources are going towards mitigation, maybe about 80%, 20% going to adaptation. And so there's been a big call for us to see at least 50% of climate finance go to adaptation. And that is why in the COP 27, 28 coming up, there's going to be a big push for this adaptation fund, this loss and damage fund, to address these damages on these small countries and to give us a chance to be able to create a future that is secure in respect of the climate. Now remember, we are among the lowest emitters of greenhouse gases, but the hardest hit. And unfortunately, so far, the largest emitters are not coming up with the resources that are required to support us doing adaptation, addressing some of the climate resilience issues we have in our country. In every sector, whether it's tourism, you're building a hotel, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in infrastructure, be they road, energy, other utilities, we have to be climate smart. But those require resources. And what is compounding the challenge for St. Kitts and Nevis is the fact, not only are climate resources scarce, because we're small, we do not have access to the international capital markets in the same way large economies like the United States and Europe have. They can go into the global markets and they can raise funds, and they do that every day. We do not have that access. And then on top of that, to add insult to injury, we are now classified as high income, meaning too rich to qualify for development grants and resources. You see our dilemma. So we have to rely on resources like CBI, and that's a whole other conversation, to generate resources to assist us with our development. And even as we speak, we know that there's some storm clouds gathering around CBI, citizenship by investment, which we have to protect. So on financing, we have a real challenge, but we have to continue our strong advocacy and build partnerships to generate the resources that we need. And I want to conclude on this point by saying we have to generate resources internationally, climate finance and so on, but we also have to generate resources domestically. So we believe, for example, we have to use more of our regional savings to be able to help support our development. By itself, those savings cannot build out what we need, but we think they can leverage, or we can leverage them to attract additional external finance. So for example, in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, we have $25 billion in savings. In St. Kitts and Nevis, we have at least $3 billion in savings. We need to get more of those resources channeled towards development. But we have to do that packaged with international assistance. So I'm just setting the table a little bit about the financing landscape. Because when you talk about sustainable development, you have to talk about financing. It has to get funded as it's talk. Somebody has to pay. And that's how we have to consider the various sources of financing to allow us to meet this agenda.
$3 billion in saving, is that considered healthy for our country, the size of St. Kitts?
Yeah, that's considered healthy. That is considered healthy. And so the question is, how do we have a challenge. In our banking system, a lot of the resources are parked there as deposits. That's a good thing. People are saving. What we want to see more of is investing. That's the side we're not seeing. Because the truth is, in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, only 1 in 25 persons, or 4% of our people, are invested in the regional or international capital markets. Why am I saying this? Because it is a source of wealth creation for the rest of the world. If you look at the United States, 3 in 5 persons, 60%, invest in the stock market and generate income and wealth from the stock market. In the ECCU, notwithstanding our savings, only 4%. And of course, these days when people invest, I'm here in cryptos. And while I don't want to go into that this evening, I want to make the point that it's not the best or the safest or most prudent investment. There are other opportunities, and I like the fact, for example, recently there was a launch of this UTC Global Fund with only a minimum investment of 100 US or 270 EC that people can use to begin to get their feet wet with investing. And as we think about the 40th anniversary of independence in this country, we want to think about how our people can generate wealth, not just from real estate, not just from businesses, but also from the investing of their savings. And that's a whole other conversation, but I think it's important as part of the discussion about financing our development. And nothing that I've just said should be misconstrued to suggest that we're letting the international community off the hook for their responsibility, especially in respect of the climate. They promised in the Paris Agreement that was signed in Paris in 2015 that by the year 2020, there'll be $100 billion every year in climate finance to support the climate resilience agenda. They have not delivered on this target, and we have to hold them accountable. And so that is why COP is important, but also what goes on in between COPs, the Conference of the Parties under the UNFCCC, to allow us to generate the resources that we need. That's why, for example, the World Bank and the new president has given a clear commitment to give more support and focus on climate finance from the World Bank, which is the world's largest development bank. And I'll stop there for the moment.
Well, I would just add to the discussion about the financing, and I cannot have this discussion and not mention Prime Minister Mia Mottley, because she has really been a champion for...
That's, of course, in Barbados.
Yes, Prime Minister of Barbados. She, of course, has been, you know, the champion, so to speak, with regards to the access to funding, and certainly the need that, you know, lending money to small island states to recover from the impacts of climate change and having these high interest rates would only continue to cripple our economies. Yes. And so she has really been engaged with the President of the World Bank and others to ensure that the small island states can get access to funding, can have some clauses that would allow us to have some reprieve in the event that there is a natural disaster and our economy is not progressing as it ought to. But one of the things I would want to say, as the governor mentioned about the capacity for investment here in the region, just recently, this year actually, in the Bahamas, the amount of seagrass that the Bahamas has as a country is equivalent to about $54 billion when one looks at the volume of trading, the ability to capture carbon dioxide. And so while we may not have, you know, a lot of the other resources, our seagrass beds actually capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere much faster than the rainforest, etc. We here in St. Kitts and Nevis has a large seagrass bed area, and some of the things that we should be able to do is to quantify the amount of seagrass that we have, how much carbon dioxide it is able to remove from the atmosphere, and then monetize that in some way. And so when we look at even the advances in the CBI recently with regards to providing options for public benefactor options, etc., looking at our natural resources and how we can capitalize on them are some of the things that we can look at. Now, while there are these large funding opportunities there, the access to them, as the governor said, is a bit of a challenge. Now, I'm looking at, we have the PAC 2030 agreement, which provides a framework for the USA to assist the Caribbean islands. Again, we do not want to have the challenge where, with all of the red tape and the challenges to access the fund, we run out of time. However, we recognize that there are some provisions in that it's the partnership to address climate crisis. It establishes a relationship between the USA and the Caribbean. And I'm heartened by the fact that even though there's a lot of soft assistance in terms of technical approaches, etc., under this agreement, there is a provision to provide internships and to build capacity. And so while we look at building our resilience to the impacts of climate change, I'm hoping that even though the funding sometimes seems a bit distant, if we're able to get our youths and our entrepreneurs in these internship programs where they can benefit from understanding the technology and understanding how to apply them here in our country, in our region, then I think we would be making a step forward in that direction. And so as the governor said, there's a Paris Agreement, there's the Loss and Damage Fund, we now have the PAC 2030 framework. However, accessing the funds is so much of a challenge, and I am quite certain at the next COP meeting that I don't think Prime Minister Mia Mottley is going to walk away empty-handed, and so I'm quite looking forward to the outcome from that meeting.
I should mention that in terms of COP27, St. Kitts and Nevis also having its highest level of representation on a ministerial level, where we would have seen the Honorable Congress Maynard, the Minister also for Environment, that would be the Honorable Dr. Joya Clark, and I believe Eric Evelyn, who is also in the Nevis Island administration as an elected member and minister there. They would have represented the Federation at COP27. I would have been doing some strong advocacy as well too. But I want to talk a bit about, now as we speak about the spending and the investing that needs to take place, there also needs to be investing, a sort of a shifting of the dichotomy to what it is we produce here in St. Kitts and Nevis. Because as we looked at the definition earlier of SIDS, it talked about the remoteness and external shocks. Now, food security is an important thing that is needed to be done, and you can't really have as being developed as a sustainable island state without being able to feed your population.
You can't, and unfortunately, our reality is that in St. Kitts and Nevis, about 25% of everything we import here, food accounts for 25% of all of our imports. I think last year the figure was around 180 million EC dollars, I believe, and growing up. And so there's this big discussion about how we align ourselves with the CARICOM target of reducing our food input bill by 25% by 2025, 25 by 25. And that requires us to make some significant investment in our food and nutrition security, but also to address our tastes and preferences. Because the reality is that we like foreign. The reality is that often ultra-processed foods, which are bad for our health, are cheaper than locally produced food. And so this is not a simple or straightforward conversation, because it requires investing in food production and storage. We saw what happened during the pandemic. For a while, we were worried if the ships didn't arrive from Miami on time, what would we have to eat? On these islands, about 80% of all that we consume in terms of food, we actually import. So we would have a problem if the ships did not arrive. So we have to see more about investment. So for example, on the island of Nevis, I gather that you are close to self-sufficiency in pork, and I think there's one other area that you're pursuing. I don't think you're there in poultry yet. Lettuce, good. That's a good start. Obviously, I hope eventually energy, the geothermal would be good for Nevis and the Federation. On St. Kitts, I don't know whether it's sweet potatoes or, we have to get more of that food production going, which is good for the economy and good for our bodies, our health. And so that has to be a big focus. And that is, of course, tied to the Sustainable Development Goal. I think it might be goal number 2 with respect to food, reducing hunger and the whole question of access to food. Because one of the things, by the way, that was discovered during the pandemic is that we have a situation where in our region, I don't have a specific number for St. Kitts and Nevis, we are food insecure. And when I say food insecurity is about access, but it's also about the quality of the food that we access in. And when they checked, about 59% of our people surveyed actually indicated that they were food insecure or very insecure. And the other side of that is what we see with NCDs, which is to say almost 8 in 10 deaths in our region, including here in the Federation, come from the chronics, the NCDs, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, obesity, and so on, and clearly heart disease. We have to address that issue. Because if you look at our health bill, we might be generating resources and then spending more in our health systems, especially in terms of tertiary care, if we're not addressing primary care, what we eat, how we eat, and also the prevention aspect. So, we can go many directions with this issue, but food and nutrition security is a fundamental pillar. And I was very pleased when Prime Minister Drew, in his budget address, when he articulated the Sustainable Development Agenda, food and nutrition security was identified as one of the important pillars. And I think that's an important focus.
And I would add, when we look at food security here in St. Kitts and Nevis, we do have the fertile land that is certainly necessary for the development of agriculture. We also look at our fishery sector, and we really have not developed the fishery sector as much as we can. And so I was quite pleased to listen to the Minister of Agriculture here in St. Kitts and Nevis speak about the plans to implement with regards to the 25 by 25 for the CARICOM initiative. When we look at aquaculture, for example, that is something that is growing as an industry globally, but here in St. Kitts and Nevis, we really have not tapped into it as much. When we look at our agriculture, our crop farming, we do still import quite a lot of pesticides and fertilizers, etc. And all of these, there are opportunities for us to build new industries if we're really focused on being self-reliant and understanding how we can capitalize on a lot of our natural vegetation, whether it's terrestrial or marine, that have not been exploited yet. But you would hear some of the older folks saying that the neem bush is good to keep away certain pests from your plants. You would hear some of the people say that fish waste is good to fertilize your crops. The same sargassum that we spoke about before has been tested. It has been successful in some areas. In others, it has not been. But certainly finding an industry that would make use of this natural waste, so to speak, these are some of the things that we would want to look at as we move towards food security, because it's one thing when we would want to, do the planting, etc. But if we are still reliant on external sources for the fertilizers and the pesticides and all of those, the seedlings, etc. So there's really a broad range of possibilities when we look at food security and how we can really develop St. Kitts and Nevis to be self-reliant in that regard. And the capacity is there to do it. I know, in fact, I walked in on one of the shirts I saw had something about support local farmers. I think once you have that framework of sustainability and, of course, highlighting food security under the St. Kitts Nevis agenda for sustainability, it allows you to focus and prioritize what you would want to do. And as we're speaking of food security and crop production, of course we must look at the issue of water, because we do know that we must irrigate our crops, and the scarcity of water is an issue not just for humans but also for the agricultural sector. And so based on some of the work that has been done, what is being looked at with regards to the desalination plants, etc., and water catchment and different ways, the hydroponics and aquaponics, these systems that would allow you to really be self-sufficient. And I'm saying this because when we speak about being resilient, we must look at all aspects of the industry and find ways to ensure that we do not have to depend on the ships that are going to be coming in. Of course, the cost of fuel, we have no control over that. We have no control about inflation externally, but when it comes here, we have to absorb that. So when we look at food security, whether it's from the marine sector or terrestrial area, it is important that we look at the entire gambit, look at it from a holistic point of view, so that every single thing that we need, we're able to generate here in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Dr. Daniel Hodge, Governor Antoine, stand by. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll continue our conversation on the other side of the break. We'll be right back with more of conversations, reflections, and the way forward.
St. Kitts, Nevis, at the nicest place, but I run from here, man, defend it like a Lensha say. Now sell out me country, my little paradise, yeah. I am a product of the island. I know where else I wouldn't change if you know what I know. Land of beauty.
The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we discuss the Sustainable Island State Agenda. The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today, and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we discuss the Sustainable Island State Agenda.
Welcome back to Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. We continue our conversations now about the Sustainable Island Agenda that the government has set for St. Kitts and Nevis, and we continue our discussion with Dr. Janice Daniel Hodge, who is an elected member of the Nevis Island Assembly, and Governor Timothy Antoine, who is the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank Governor. Thank you very much. We continue our conversation now. We spoke about the importance of renewable energy. You touched on that, Governor. The importance of us being able to be self-sufficient in being able to power our systems and do so without harming the environment. And of course, there is, the looking at the geothermal project, which Nevis is pursuing, and of course the government is also looking at other initiatives such as solar, such as wind energy. I know that the ECCB in particular has a solar initiative. Can you tell us about how that initiative in terms of using the solar energy, using alternative energy sources to help St. Kitts and Nevis to pursue its sustainable island agenda all fits together?
Well, I think we have to start with a clear understanding. We cannot transform these islands, St. Kitts and Nevis, if we do not transform our energy situation. If you're paying 30, 35 US cents per kilowatt hour for electricity, you cannot go far with respect to anything in terms of sustainability, whether that is agriculture, whether that is tourism. Let me give you an example. In Mexico, a typical hotel would be paying about 3% of their room rate for energy. In the Eastern Caribbean, that number is between 20 and 30%. Are you following me? It makes it's hard to compete when so much of our room rate for hotels, tourism is our main sector, goes towards energy. So clearly, transformation requires that we transform our energy sector. We don't have many natural resources. We're water scarce, as Dr. Hodge pointed out. But certainly we have an abundance of sun for most of the year. And we have to harness that. And that is why, at the central bank, we took the position that we would generate all of our energy needs on our campus from solar PV. And with our battery storage, which we installed, completed in February of this year, we're generating essentially about 100% of our needs. We still are connected to the grid. We still export, and occasionally we could import if we need to, but we're exporting to the grid. So we need to see in our member countries, including St. Kitts and Nevis, a focus on renewables. So at our campus, 1 megawatts of energy. The largest non-utility solar plant in the Eastern Caribbean is at our central bank, at our campus. Here in St. Kitts and Nevis, I believe your peak load is around 26 megawatts, I believe it is. So we believe that solar PV presents a very important opportunity for St. Kitts and Nevis. And then immediately, that's for us a relatively low-hanging fruit. And then, not so long from now, we hope the geothermal would come. And I particularly like geothermal, not just geothermal development on the island of Nevis, but the connection, the connectivity of the grids. That's a powerful development. And I want to commend both, the federal as well as the NIA for coming together on this issue. I think it is the way to go. So when I was in Nevis recently or early in the year, somebody asked me about the road. I said, well, right now I'm thinking about the energy bridge. That's the one I'm focused on, the connection of the grids, because I could see the value for the Federation in terms of transformation and the sustainability agenda for farmers, for business people, for people in tourism, for manufacturers, agro-manufacturers. So much hangs on the energy, access to, for small households. So that is an area, and I think that's goal number 7 in the SDGs, clean and access to clean and efficient energy. We need to push, and I strongly encourage the government to continue to move in that direction and to do so with alacrity. Now, I must tell you, there are policy issues that need to be addressed. So, for example, you must address the feed-in tariff. If I'm going to invest in renewable energy, I need clarity about the feed-in tariff because I need to know what my payback period is going to be. Whether I'm going to a bank to fund or I'm self-funding, I need to know what is going to be my payback period. So I can tell you at the central bank, while we do not yet get any money from the state for our funds to the grid, for our energy to the grid, and we hope to address that in due course. We want a credit. We're not asking for money. I've been clear on that. Give us credit. There's value to the energy that we bring. But they haven't yet articulated the tariff. Now, for the people in the private sector to want to invest, they have to have that clarity, as they won't, right? And I think the state has to make a decision how much of the private sector is going to be called upon to invest in renewables, because there are implications for the grid and the cost of the service for the remaining customers, and how much of it they're going. So much will be micro producers or independent power producers, and what the state will produce at the utility level. But it's important from the resilience standpoint, and Dr. Hodge has touched on resilience a few times, and that's an important concept, that you don't have all of your energy in one place. So you want to have some microgrids. I'm proud of the fact that at our central bank, we got an award for the best microgrid at the Renewable Energy Conference, CREF, earlier this year, for the best microgrid project because of what we've done there with 1 megawatts. So you may want to have something in Sandy Point. You may want to have something in Nevis. You may want to have something in Molyneux, in addition to the main thing in Basse-Terre, to give you some some diversification or some kind of that dispersion of your utility power sources. But my point is that feed-in tariff is important to be able to give clarity about what the payback period is going to be. We have shared, and I'll end there, we at the Central Bank have shared very liberally with the Minister for Energy. On invitation, he came with a full team, both in the ministry and SCELEC, to look at what we've done, to share freely our experiences, including our sources, our network, and we remain available to the government of St. Kitts and Nevis in any way we can to support their drive towards renewable energy. But for water, and I said I'll end it, but for the water issue that Dr. Hodge mentioned earlier, again, you've got to power water. You need renewable energy. So it touches so many aspects of life, economic as well as social and cultural, that water is life. Renewable energy is a must.
And Dr. Daniel Hodge, in terms of as the governor mentioned, in terms of the social aspect of it, of course, you know, when you look at persons, and I know in Nevis in particular, there is assistance for seniors with their electricity bills. They're not charged that. It's important to assist with helping people to get out of poverty, because, of course, you know, they don't want to create that dependence on the state. And unfortunately, there are a lot of commentators that will tell you that there's too much of that here in St. Kitts and Nevis. So you're trying to lift people out of poverty. And in doing so, it's important that you cut the cost, as we mentioned, in terms of the food that they buy, because, you know, you produce locally, so the prices should be cheaper in terms of the cost of energy that they have to pay for, and of course having water that they may be able to produce in industry, or also just be able to sustain their families. Can you comment on that in terms of the poverty aspect of it?
Yes, and so when we look at a typical household, and you look at the cost of living in terms of your basic needs, whether it's for your groceries, you have to pay your mortgage or your rent, you have your children to take care of. The cost of electricity right now, it's really too high. It is too high a percentage of the revenues that are being generated. And as we know, when you have high electricity bills, it is something that you really cannot get around. And I have seen people have to decide whether or not they should keep their Wi-Fi service. Well, of course, you cannot keep your Wi-Fi without electricity, and so you would need to pay your electricity bill. And so when we look at some of the challenges, you need electricity, you need water. These are basic needs that we have. And to the extent that the government can forge ahead to bring renewable energy to the households mostly, then I think it gives you a bit more breathing room. You have a bit more disposable income. Not disposable income for things that are not necessary, but because we currently do not have the control about the cost of food that is coming in, and people really struggle between their grocery bills and the electricity bills, etc. With regards to the diversification of renewable energy, here in St. Kitts and Nevis, again, we are blessed with natural resources. We do not have oil and all of these things that are being phased out. But of course, when we look at the opportunity that we have, not only do we have solar energy, we also have wind energy, opportunities for wind energy, and the geothermal energy. And most of the reports, all of the reports basically have indicated that geothermal would be the cheapest, cleanest form of renewable energy. And so while we're looking in the short, it's always good to have a short term, a medium term, and a long term. And so ultimately, if we can get to the long term goal of having geothermal energy, then we would not have to worry about how we would dispose of the solar panels that are no longer operational, the batteries, the storage batteries, etc. And so as the governor mentioned earlier, while we are creating one means of being reliant, we still have to look at the overall picture. And so certainly if we are able to get to the point of geothermal energy where the cost of electricity would be much cheaper, then I think that would have a great impact on the poverty, not only because of the households, but then you would have a greater appeal for investment in the country, for new businesses to come on stream. Hopefully you could have much better paying jobs in these areas, because of course the investors coming in would have a much lower cost of doing business. And so of course you can go on and on about how this can be beneficial, but certainly the need for adequate water supply and the need for electricity and I think the Sustainable Development Goal, while we may have 100% infiltration with regards to access to electricity, the part that we're missing still here in St. Kitts and Nevis is that it should be affordable and clean. And so that is what we are working towards, and I'm certain that with what we're looking at with the wind energy, the solar energy, and the geothermal energy, we will be able to get to that point soon.
Let me just add very briefly. I'm advised that this year the government of St. Kitts and Nevis will spend in excess of $100 million on subsidizing energy bills for households and businesses. Just think about that. The cost is high, I agree with you. It would be a lot higher without a $100 million subsidy. But what if we could take that $100 million and invest in renewables so that we don't need to do the subsidy, but we address the question of clean and affordable energy to the SDG number 7, as Dr. Hodge just mentioned. That is where we need to go.
And Governor, as Dr. Daniel Hodge spoke about diversifying the energy sources, I also want to touch on the diversifying of the economy itself.
Yes.
How much more do St. Kitts and Nevis need to do to transform the economic diversification in order to become a sustainable island state?
We have much to do. The very nature of SIDS, as I said at the beginning, is that we rely too heavily on one sector, and in this case it's tourism. So economic diversification, and I should add, and one source of income with the citizenship by investment. That accounts for 55% of all revenue coming to St. Kitts and Nevis. Just think about that for a minute. 55%. It means, yes, it's a very important source. Yes, St. Kitts has the oldest and largest CBI program in the Caribbean. But it also means that St. Kitts and Nevis is the most dependent. And therefore, that is a source of strength, but also vulnerability. And when people talk about diversifying from CBI, very often there's a sort of visceral reaction that somebody's anti-CBI. That's not the point. The point is, if CBI were to go away, God forbid, but if it were to go away, what would happen? It would be a catastrophe. So that is why you want to do two things. One, you want to invest very prudently the resources of CBI. And I welcome the announcement by the Prime Minister that they will be setting up a sovereign wealth fund. I think that's important. Because what you want to do is to make sure that some of these resources are being invested so that they can go into the productive sectors. And if, God forbid, tomorrow CBI goes, you have a pool of resources on which to draw to fund your development. So you have to think no, but you have to think long. Secondly, you have to ensure that the resources that are being deployed, so you have some investing, but the resources that you are deploying are going into the productive sector. And yes, some will go into the social sector as well, but you've got to get that balance right. If you have a balance where it's more social than economic, that might feel good now, but it's going to hurt your prospects for development later. Because you've got to invest now in renewable energy, you've got to invest in water, you've got to invest in food and nutrition security, all of those things. So on diversification, part of it is we diversifying our revenue sources. The economic sectors, Dr. Hodge mentioned the seabed, the seagrass, as an area that we need to consider, quantify and monitor. To the extent that it's a carbon sink, then we could generate resources. Guyana is doing that with their forests. Bahamas is pursuing it, as she indicated. Others are considering we need to do that. Then there's the whole question of energy, whether it's tidal energy or wind energy, for example. Again, that's the blue economy area. Fisheries, that was mentioned. That's an area where we could do more in terms of fishing, to get more of our protein from fish, both for domestic consumption and for export. There's the issue of health tourism. But I want to be clear. We must diversify around tourism, so not abandon tourism. I'm not in that camp where you say tourism, forget tourism. No, we can't do that. You can diversify around. So for example, The government has talked recently about creating a health city with the building of a new hospital and with the Ross University and some other research laboratories around that area to create a health hub. If that were to happen, then you have the possibility of creating a new sector, whether you call it medical tourism, whatever you call it, that can generate jobs, economic opportunity for an exchange, but also improve health. Then there is the issue, more controversial, of medical cannabis. So I'm just mentioning some possibilities with respect to diversification. Obviously, we don't have time to do a deep dive.
Well, in terms of the diversification, one of the areas, and you mentioned right at the top about the need for us to have more adaptation projects.
Yes.
Adaptation projects are essential for building resiliency because while we're looking at the mitigating to minimize the release of carbon dioxide, we also must recognize that we have no control over the natural disasters, over the hurricanes, etc., that may still come. And so we would want to be able to shore up our islands as much as possible. One of the areas that I see that has been overlooked quite often and where you can have significant job opportunities is in the area of restoring our coastal wetlands, our mangroves, etc. And those, of course, would lead to the health of the marine environment, lead to the health of our fisheries sector, continue to keep our seagrass beds productive. And so we don't see enough of protecting our coastal resources that contribute billions in economic services, environmental services. And when we look around St. Kitts and Nevis and we look at all of the coastal wetlands, a lot are being under pressure from development. But there are a lot that can be restored, protected, plant, mangroves, reforest these areas. And that is something that I think we have really overlooked because when the mangroves become filled with sediment, filled with waste, then the productivity decreases. It impacts our fisheries. Of course, we know the mangrove provides habitat for the juvenile fish, but if there's no place for the juvenile fish to go, eventually our fisheries is going to be impacted. And so when we look at the ecological services and the value that these provide, there's really a great opportunity to focus some job opportunities around those areas. And it can only be a win-win situation for us in the long run. Now, as I mentioned, the ecological services that we get from some of these coastal areas, we also must look at the waste that is being generated. Mm-hmm. Most of these islands are small, St. Kitts and Nevis as well. Here in St. Kitts and Nevis, our landfills are close to capacity, but we still welcome, we cannot say, well, we do not want, the tourists to come, etc. But when we look at the solid waste collected around the time of Music Fest, around the time of Culturama, we must look at these things and how are we managing our waste. And so if we want to be sustainable, if we want to be resilient, we have to find means and ways to encourage people to come. Yes, we want the foreign exchange, but as a country, we must look at that as well. And so in some areas, you have bottles being recycled. Just speaking as we speak about economic diversification, find ways to generate jobs for people that are at the same time will help to build resilience in the country and our natural assets that we have.
It's just over 6 minutes left in tonight's conversation, and so I want to ask a very broad question, but very specific as well as it relates to the SDGs. Of course, we would establish that the SDGs are Sustainable Development Goals. The target is to achieve these things by 2030. Now, considering the failures of the past as it relates to the Millennium Development Goals, which was from 1990 to 2015, all of them were not achieved, and there were just 7 of them. Now, the SDGs are more ambitious, but the question is, with just 6 years and a couple of months left, is it realistic for the world, and much less smaller countries like St. Kitts and Nevis, to achieve the SDGs by 2030?
Well, the answer is clearly no. We are not on track to achieve the SDGs. We will not achieve the SDGs by 2030. Now, there are 17 goals, and there are some areas that will be achieved. And some countries will achieve some areas, and not other areas. But I think we will find, God willing, by 2030, a disappointing scorecard. Because the resources that are needed to help, especially SIDS, have not been forthcoming. And then we've had the setback with the pandemic and with certain shocks. Inflation now, before that hurricanes, whether it's Irma, Maria, or before that, there are several. So those are not helping. And then you have we haven't talked about it tonight, but there's a geopolitical environment in which SIDS are operating. And that's important for us to understand, because there's a climate, but there's also the reordering of the geopolitical alliances. We've seen it post-pandemic in particular. We've seen it now with the war in Ukraine and so on. And that is an important context to help define the content of our policies and our sustainable development agenda, but also the conduct of our policies. So, for example, as we pursue the SDGs, we have to pursue partnerships, which actually is identified as an important area. The Caribbean's foreign policy stance has always been, it was initially articulated, I believe, by Barrow, friends of all, satellites of none. That is still essentially the doctrine, the foreign policy doctrine of our country. So we look for appropriate alliances. We are not ideological in the way we pursue our relationships. We pursue around values and around shared goals. And we look for partners who could help us. So not east or west, not capitalist or something else. We look for we look for partners, not ideologies, around values, around goals, and we work towards. And we have to pursue those partnerships, whether it is within the region, with respect to what we do, or outside of the region. So, for example, now there's a move to try to build a relationship with the African continent, recognizing that we are part of the African diaspora, the next region, and the need for us. So Africa Exim Bank, several of our countries, including St. Kitts and Nevis, has gone to Parliament with enabling legislation to support building up that relationship with Africa through the Africa Exim Bank. That's important as we talk about diversifying, again, our sources of funding, our partners to support the SDGs. But I gave a long answer to answer the question in short. No, we're not on target. And we have to do a lot more to get much closer to the SDGs than we are at the minute. And COP coming up will be another important opportunity to see how we can galvanize resources, mobilize resources for that.
And I'll just add to that, the irony of the fact that we recognize that SIDS are vulnerable, they need special attention. If we look at the Caribbean region, and what we're seeing, as the governor mentioned earlier, because of the income that is generated from the CBI program, we are no longer considered eligible for official development assistance. But when you look at the vulnerabilities of St. Kitts and Nevis and the other SIDS, one hurricane and the amount that has to be invested in rebuilding and getting back on track, that pretty much wipes out your economy. So it's, the help is being offered on one hand, and it seems like, on the other hand, you're finding ways to remove it. And so I have heard the Prime Minister speak quite often about the need for the multidimensional vulnerability index, where our vulnerability should be captured much broader than it is right now based on GDP and GNI. And so when we look at our expenses and how quickly they can be eroded based on our location, based on our economies, etc., then certainly there has to be a push to ensure that the development assistance that is needed is actually indeed coming, understanding the reason why we are SIDS.
And unfortunately, Governor, while as you speak about the relationship with Africa, forming partnerships with different international countries, different international partners, which does include agencies as well too. And you mentioned Africa in particular. Of course, we would have seen the trend where Africa seems to be, or some African states that it seems to be leaning more away from the West
Yes.
to another country, or
Yes.
other countries as well too, that may not have the same ideology that we have. And so those are some of the threats that would have to be considered as we form partnerships. And I would have loved to have a discussion with that. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Right, but I just want to say as we wrap, when we talk about sustainability, we cannot forget, or not to forget, the importance of our relationship with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The Bible says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord's. Except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord watches the city, the watchman wakes in vain." And I want to say, as we think about sustainability in this country and across our region, faith is important in that conversation about our values, about our way of life, and ultimately about loving God and loving people. And we didn't touch crime and security tonight, but let's be clear, the industry of crime that we've seen in our region has in part to be addressed by our values. Of course, there are other things like youth at risk, reducing our physical use of cash, and I couldn't go on and on, time wouldn't permit. But the point is, faith is very important in that discussion, and we must never forget that in this country.
An important point to leave it on. So I'd like to thank you, Governor Antoine, and of course, Janice Daniel Hodge, Dr. Janice Daniel Hodge, elected member of the Nevis Island Assembly. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Conversation.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank you for joining us as well for this edition. We trust that you will join us next week when we'll be back in Nevis, and we will have the conversation about should St. Kitts and Nevis become a republic. For now, I'm Ian Richards. Thank you so much for joining us.
St. Kitts, Nevis, at the nicest place, but I run from here, man, defend it, like a Lensha say. Nah, sell out me country, my little paradise. I am a product of the island. I know it's a nice. Wouldn't change if you know what I know. Land of beauty.
The St. Kitts and Nevis Independence 40 Committee presents Conversations, Reflections, and the Way Forward. This interactive discussion series provides an in-depth view of the trials and achievements of the past, as well as the accomplishments, threats, and tremendous opportunities of today and in the coming years that will transform the Twin Island Federation into a model sustainable island state, serving as a beacon for all. On this edition, we discuss the Sustainable Island State Agenda,